You're a bath attendant in the baths of Caracalla, and the year is 212 CE. The marble gleams, the mosaics shimmer, and the scent of perfumed oils fills the air. But beneath this veneer of civilization lurks a truth that would make modern health inspectors weep. You're essentially working in a magnificent petri dish where Rome's elite come to marinate in each other's filth. The water you're standing beside hasn't been changed in weeks. That's not a malfunction, that's by design. Your hands are raw from scraping the accumulated grime off senators' backs with your bronze strigil, and you've learned not to look too closely at what's floating in the communal pools. The Romans called these baths the pinnacle of civilization, a triumph of engineering and social refinement. But as you watch a respected magistrate casually relieve himself in the same pool where children are splashing, you understand a different truth. These baths are civilization and barbarism in perfect, horrifying equilibrium. Before we dive into the murky waters of Roman bathing culture, if you enjoy learning about the less glamorous realities of ancient history, consider subscribing for more content like this. The Romans left us incredible architectural achievements and legal systems, but they also left us sobering lessons about what happens when public health takes a back seat to social convention. To understand why Roman baths were biohazards disguised as luxury amenities, you must first grasp their central role in Roman society. These weren't simple places to get clean. They were the social media platforms of the ancient world, where reputations were made and destroyed, business deals were struck, political alliances were formed, and the entire social hierarchy of Rome was performed daily in various states of undress. The typical Roman bath complex, or thermae, was an architectural marvel that would impress even today. The largest facilities, like the baths of Diocletian, could accommodate thousands of people simultaneously. They featured multiple pools at different temperatures, exercise yards, libraries, gardens, shops, and even brothels. The engineering required to heat and circulate water through these massive structures represented some of Rome's finest technical achievements. Romans from all social classes visited the baths daily, though rarely together. The wealthy came in the afternoon after their business concluded. The working classes came later in the evening. Women bathed separately from men, either at different hours or in separate facilities. This segregation, however, did nothing to address the fundamental hygiene problems that plagued all bathhouses regardless of who was using them. The bathing ritual followed a prescribed sequence that every Roman knew by heart. You'd begin in the apoditerium, the changing room, where you'd strip naked and hand your clothes to an attendant who was probably planning to steal them. From there, you'd proceed to the palestra, for exercise, wrestling, ball games, or weightlifting to work up a proper sweat. The Romans believed you needed to be thoroughly dirty before you could get truly clean, a philosophy that makes more sense when you understand their actual cleaning methods. Next came the tepidarium, a warm room where you'd begin the transition to the hot bath. Here, slaves would apply olive oil to your entire body. Not a light moisturizing application, mind you, but a thorough coating that would mix with your sweat, dead skin cells, and the accumulated grime of Roman city life. This oily sludge would then be scraped off with a curved metal tool called a strigil, removing the top layer of filth in long, greasy strips that fell directly onto the floor, where they'd be swept into corners or, more often, simply trampled into the tile. The caldarium, or hot room, was the heart of the bathing experience. Fed by Hippocaust heating systems that circulated hot air beneath raised floors, these rooms reached temperatures that modern saunas would envy. Romans would sit in the oppressive heat, sweating profusely, while slaves continued the oil and scrape process. The air was thick with steam, body odour, and the distinctive smell of rancid olive oil mixed with human secretions. But here's where things get truly disgusting from a modern perspective. The Romans didn't understand germ theory. They had no concept of bacteria, viruses, or microscopic pathogens. Their medical knowledge, advanced in many ways, was completely ignorant of the invisible world of disease transmission. This ignorance manifested in bathing practices that would horrify any contemporary public health official. The communal pools were the most problematic feature of Roman baths, and not for reasons the Romans would have recognized. These pools were large, beautiful, and filled with water that was rarely changed completely. The largest bath complexes had some water circulation, with fresh water flowing in from aqueducts and old water flowing out through drains, but the turnover rate was abysmal by modern standards. Consider the mathematics of contamination. A single large bath might hold hundreds of bathers over the course of a day. Each person brought with them the accumulated filth of Roman urban life: street dirt, animal waste tracked in on feet, residual olive oil, sweat, and dead skin cells. The Romans did not shower before entering communal baths. The bath itself was the cleaning mechanism, which meant that everyone was essentially stewing in a diluted mixture of everyone else's grime. The water temperature made things worse. Romans preferred their baths hot, often maintaining pool temperatures between 80 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the perfect incubation range for bacterial growth. Pathogenic bacteria like E. coli, Staphylococcus, and various streptococcal species would have thrived in these conditions, multiplying exponentially in the warm, nutrient-rich environment. But the microbial problems were only the beginning. The Romans had remarkably casual attitudes toward bodily functions in the baths. Urination in the pools was not just tolerated but expected. The Romans actually valued urine for its ammonia content, which they believed had cleaning properties. They weren't entirely wrong. Ammonia is a mild disinfectant, but they failed to account for the many other compounds in human waste that make it decidedly unhygienic. Historical sources confirm that public urination in the baths was commonplace. The satirist Martial complained about bathers who would relieve themselves in the pools, rather than using the designated latrines. His complaint suggests this behaviour was both widespread and socially accepted, at least among certain classes. The fact that he felt compelled to write about it indicates it was annoying but not shocking, a social nuisance rather than a taboo violation. Defecation in the baths was theoretically forbidden, but the evidence suggests it happened with uncomfortable regularity. Pliny the Elder mentions various regulations against fouling the baths, which implies the regulations were necessary because people were, in fact, fouling the baths. Archaeological evidence from drain systems in Roman bathhouses has revealed exactly what you'd expect: fecal matter, parasitic worm eggs, and other biological materials that shouldn't have been there if everyone was using the proper facilities. The sharing of bathwater wasn't the only vector for disease transmission. The strigils used to scrape oil and grime off bathers' bodies were communal tools, passed from person to person with minimal, if any, cleaning between uses. A strigil that had just scraped the infected skin lesions off one bather might be used on the next customer within minutes, transferring bacteria, fungi, and viral particles directly into any small cuts or abrasions in the skin. The olive oil itself was a contamination nightmare. Slaves carried around large vessels of oil, applying it liberally to bather after bather using their bare hands. The same hands that had just spread oil on a leper might be spreading oil on a senator moments later. The oil that dripped back into the vessels after application would be reused, creating a contaminated suspension that grew more biologically diverse with each application. Skin diseases must have spread through Roman bathhouses like wildfire through dry grass. Ringworm, athlete's foot, impetigo, scabies, and various fungal infections would have found ideal transmission conditions in the warm, moist environment, where people with active infections shared water, oil, and scraping tools with healthy individuals. The Romans noticed these patterns. Medical texts from the period describe various skin afflictions that seem to have been particularly common among bathgoers, but they attributed them to bad air or imbalanced humours rather than person-to-person transmission. The towels and cloths used in Roman baths present another vector for contamination. These textiles were shared among multiple bathers, washed infrequently, and dried in the bath's warm, humid environment. Perfect conditions for bacterial and fungal colonization. A clean towel in a Roman bath might harbour millions of microorganisms from dozens of previous users, ready to transfer to the next person's skin, eyes, or any other mucous membrane they contacted. Waterborne parasites would have thrived in Roman bath conditions. Giardia, Cryptosporidium, and various amoebic parasites can survive in water for extended periods, and require only tiny infectious doses to cause illness. A single infected individual using a communal bath could potentially infect dozens of others in a single day. The Romans did suffer from chronic diarrheal diseases, which they attributed to various causes, but which were likely maintained by continuous reinfection through contaminated water sources, including bathhouse pools. The architectural features that made Roman baths so impressive also contributed to their health hazards. The hypocaust heating systems created spaces beneath the floors where water would condense, creating damp environments perfect for mold growth. These molds would release spores into the air above, where bathers would inhale them. Some species of mold produce mycotoxins that can cause respiratory problems, allergic reactions, and long-term health issues with repeated exposure. The steam rooms and hot pools created humidity levels that would make modern building inspectors nervous. Relative humidity above 60% promotes the growth of dust mites, mold, and bacteria on surfaces. Roman bathhouses routinely exceeded 80% humidity in some areas, creating surfaces that were essentially biological films of moisture-loving microorganisms. Every time a bather touched a wall, sat on a bench, or leaned against a column, they were making contact with this microbial layer. The cold pools weren't any better from a hygiene perspective. While colder temperatures slow bacterial growth, they don't stop it entirely, and they do nothing to prevent viral transmission. The Roman practice of plunging into cold water immediately after emerging from hot baths created a thermal shock that would have stressed bathers' immune systems, potentially making them more susceptible to the pathogens they were simultaneously being exposed to. The social customs of Roman bathing compounded these problems. It was customary to bring food and drink into the baths, to eat and socialize while soaking in the communal pools. Crumbs, fruit pits, and liquid spills would fall into the water, providing additional nutrients for bacterial growth. Wine, beer, and other alcoholic beverages were consumed freely, leading to impaired judgment and decreased inhibition, a perfect recipe for the casual violation of whatever minimal hygiene standards existed. Enslaved bath attendants bore the brunt of these conditions. They spent entire days in the hot, humid environment, constantly exposed to the biological emissions of hundreds of bathers. They cleaned the floors with implements that were themselves rarely cleaned, spreading contaminated water from one area to another. They handled soiled textiles, scraped diseased skin, and worked in close physical contact with infected individuals without any understanding of disease transmission or protective measures. The mortality rate among bath slaves must have been extraordinary, though we have limited direct evidence because Roman society didn't consider slave deaths worth detailed recording. What we do know is that life expectancy for Roman slaves was significantly lower than for free citizens, and those working in conditions like bathhouses would have been at the extreme low end of that already dismal range. The Romans did make some attempts at bath hygiene, but these efforts were woefully inadequate by modern standards. Some bathhouses employed workers to skim floating debris from the water's surface using nets or perforated ladles. This removed the most visible contamination but did nothing about dissolved or suspended microscopic materials. It was the ancient equivalent of picking the visible chunks out of spoiled milk and declaring it fresh. Periodic cleaning of the baths involved draining the pools and scrubbing the surfaces with abrasive materials. The scrubbing was effective at removing biofilm and accumulated grime, but the frequency of these cleanings varied widely. Smaller, private baths might be cleaned daily, but large public thermae might go weeks between thorough cleanings. During that time, the biological load in the water would build continuously, creating increasingly hazardous conditions. The Romans did use some substances with legitimate antimicrobial properties in their baths. They added various minerals, salts, and plant extracts to the water, some of which had genuine disinfectant effects. Sulfur compounds, in particular, have antimicrobial properties and were popular bath additives. However, the concentrations used were far too low to meaningfully disinfect the enormous volumes of water in public baths, and the Romans added these substances for their supposed therapeutic benefits rather than for sanitation. Interestingly, the Romans' own medical literature hints at their awareness that something about the baths was causing illness, even if they couldn't identify the mechanism. Physicians of the era noted that certain diseases seemed more common among frequent bathgoers. They observed that wounds and skin lesions that came into contact with bath water often became infected. Their recommended treatments, avoiding the baths during illness, cleaning wounds after bath visits, were sound advice even if their theoretical understanding was completely wrong. The spread of epidemic diseases through Roman bathhouses must have been spectacular. Diseases like typhoid fever, cholera, and dysentery, which spread through fecal-oral transmission, would have found ideal conditions in environments where people with active infections shared water with healthy individuals who might then ingest that water accidentally. A single cholera carrier using a bathhouse could potentially trigger an outbreak affecting hundreds of people. Respiratory diseases would have spread efficiently in the close quarters of hot, steamy rooms where bathers gathered. Tuberculosis, which was endemic in ancient Rome, could be transmitted through the airborne droplets produced by coughing and sneezing. The practice of socializing in the baths, with people spending hours in close proximity talking, laughing and sharing food, created perfect conditions for respiratory pathogen transmission. Sexually transmitted infections found their way into bath culture through the prostitution that was openly practiced in and around bathhouse facilities. Many thermi included small rooms that could be rented for private encounters. The combination of sexual activity and contaminated water created multiple pathways for disease transmission. Syphilis didn't arrive in Europe until after Columbus, but the Romans had plenty of other venereal diseases that circulated efficiently through their bath and brothel complex. Eye infections were remarkably common in ancient Rome, and bathhouses likely played a significant role in their spread. Conjunctivitis, trachoma, and other ocular infections can be transmitted through contaminated water or by touching infected surfaces and then rubbing one's eyes. The hot, steamy environment of the baths would have caused bathers' eyes to water and itch, encouraging rubbing and touching that facilitated disease transmission. The Romans' use of cosmetics and personal care products in the baths introduced additional contamination vectors. Lead-based face powders, antimony eye makeup and various skin creams and oils would wash off in the bath water, creating a chemical soup that was not only biologically hazardous, but also toxic. Lead is particularly problematic because it accumulates in the body over time, and chronic low-level exposure through contaminated bath water could have contributed to the cognitive decline and health problems that plagued Rome's elite. The architectural acoustics of Roman bathhouses, which the Romans celebrated for allowing conversation to echo magnificently through the space, also meant that every cough, sneeze and vocalization produced aerosols that were distributed efficiently throughout the enclosed spaces. A person with an active respiratory infection in one corner of the caldarium could be sharing their pathogens with everyone in the room within minutes, courtesy of the excellent sound-carrying properties the Romans had engineered into their baths. Children bathed alongside adults in Roman facilities, though whether this was universal practice or varied by location and social class is unclear from available sources. The presence of children introduces additional concerns because their developing immune systems would have been more vulnerable to the pathogens circulating in bathwater. Childhood mortality was extremely high in ancient Rome. Some estimates suggest that nearly half of all children died before reaching adulthood, and bathhouse-acquired infections likely contributed to this grim statistic. The Romans did recognize that some waters were healthier than others. Natural hot springs with high mineral content were considered particularly therapeutic and were the sites of dedicated healing baths. Some of these springs did have genuine health benefits. Sulfur springs, for example, can help with certain skin conditions, but the Romans couldn't distinguish between the beneficial effects of the mineral content and the harmful effects of the biological contamination that would have been present in these waters just as in urban bathhouses. The economic aspects of bathhouse operation created incentives that worked against hygiene. Operating a large thermi required enormous quantities of fuel to heat the water and massive amounts of fresh water to maintain the pools. These inputs cost money, so bathhouse operators had strong financial incentives to minimize water changes and maximize the number of bathers using each filling of the pools. The entry fees for public baths were kept intentionally low, sometimes just a quadrans, the smallest denomination of Roman currency, which meant operators had to maximize volume to maintain profitability. This economic model created a tragedy of the common situation where the collective health of all bathers was sacrificed for individual convenience and operator profit. No single bath operator could afford to maintain substantially higher hygiene standards than competitors because the costs would force them to charge higher fees, driving customers to cheaper, dirtier alternatives. The result was a race to the bottom where minimum acceptable standards became maximum actual standards. The decline of Roman bathhouse culture coincided with the rise of Christianity in the later empire, but the relationship between these phenomena is more complex than simple Christian prudishness about public nudity. Early Christian writers did criticize the baths, but their objections focused as much on the associated sexual license and social hierarchy as on the bathing itself. Some Christians continued to use public baths, though with more modest behaviour and less frequency than their pagan counterparts. What ultimately killed Roman bath culture wasn't moral objection but economic and political collapse. Maintaining the elaborate water and heating systems required to operate large thermae demanded a functioning civic infrastructure, reliable fuel supplies, and the organised labour forces that only a strong central government could provide. As the Western Roman Empire fragmented, bathhouses fell into disrepair, not because people suddenly discovered they were unsanitary, but because no one could afford to operate them anymore. The medieval period that followed saw a marked decline in communal bathing in Western Europe, though the reasons were more complex than the simple story of backward Dark Ages peasants afraid of water. Medieval Europeans did bathe, but they did so in smaller facilities with water that was changed more frequently, inadvertently creating more hygienic conditions than their Roman predecessors. The fact that medieval plague outbreaks eventually led authorities to close bathhouses suggests a developing, if imperfect, understanding that something about communal bathing facilitated disease spread. The Islamic world maintained a thriving bathhouse culture that inherited much from Roman practice, but introduced some significant improvements. Hammams typically feature a continuous flow-through water system rather than standing pools, reducing bacterial accumulation. They also incorporate private bathing chambers alongside communal areas, limiting cross-contamination. Most importantly, Islamic law's emphasis on ritual purity created religious incentives for maintaining cleanliness standards that had no equivalent in pagan Roman culture. Japanese bathing culture, which developed independently and continues to thrive today, offers an interesting contrast to Roman practices. Traditional onsen and sento bathhouses require bathers to thoroughly clean themselves with soap and water before entering communal baths, a practice that dramatically reduces the biological load in the shared water. The custom of keeping bath water extremely hot, often above 104 degrees, while uncomfortable, does help limit bacterial growth. Modern Japanese bathhouses also maintain rigorous cleaning schedules and water circulation systems. The modern revival of spa culture has fortunately learned some lessons from history. Contemporary public pools and hot tubs are subject to strict health regulations, requiring specific chlorine levels, pH balance, water circulation rates, and cleaning schedules. Regular testing ensures these standards are maintained. While pool-borne illness still occurs, the rate is orders of magnitude lower than what would have been typical in Roman baths. Yet some modern practices still court disaster in ways the Romans would recognise. Inadequately maintained hotel hot tubs, for example, can develop the same problems that plagued Roman baths. Warm, stagnant water provides ideal conditions for pathogens like Legionella bacteria, which causes Pontiac fever and Legionnaire's disease. Public pools that don't maintain proper chlorine levels can harbour Cryptosporidium and other chlorine-resistant parasites. The underlying principles of waterborne disease transmission haven't changed. Only our understanding of them has improved. The archaeological evidence from Roman bath sites provides disturbing confirmation of the historical accounts. Analysis of sediments from ancient drain systems has revealed not just the expected human waste products, but also evidence of widespread parasitic infections, heavy metal contamination, and biological markers suggesting poor water quality. Ancient latrines connected to bathhouses show evidence of various intestinal parasites that would have been transmitted through fecal contamination of shared facilities. Skeletal remains from Roman cemeteries tell their own story. Bones show evidence of chronic systemic infections, repeated episodes of severe illness, and the distinctive markers of waterborne diseases. Teeth from Roman skeletons often show enamel hypoplasia, horizontal lines in the tooth enamel that form during childhood illnesses, indicating that most Romans experienced severe illness multiple times during their developmental years, likely including infections acquired in bathhouses. The irony of Roman bath culture is that the Romans took such pride in their bathing practices as evidence of their civilization and superiority over barbarian peoples, when in fact their elaborate bathhouse culture may have made them less healthy than the supposedly primitive peoples they looked down upon. Germanic tribes that the Romans considered unwashed barbarians probably had lower rates of waterborne disease simply because they lacked the infrastructure for Roman-style communal bathing. This inversion, where sophisticated infrastructure creates worse outcomes than simpler practices, is a recurring theme in technological history. The Romans' impressive engineering gave them the ability to gather thousands of people together in elaborate bathing complexes, but their lack of microbiological knowledge meant they had no idea they were creating disease incubators. Sometimes ignorance combined with capability is more dangerous than ignorance alone. Modern historians have largely glossed over the hygiene problems of Roman baths, preferring to focus on their architectural magnificence, social significance, and engineering achievements. This is understandable. The baths really were remarkable accomplishments, but it distorts our understanding of Roman daily life. The average Roman's bath experience involved not just the pleasures of hot water and social interaction, but also a significant risk of infectious disease, skin problems, and various unpleasant contamination exposures. The preserved ruins of Roman bathhouses that tourists visit today give no hint of these problems. The empty pools and clean marble suggest a sterile antiquity that never existed. To accurately imagine these spaces as they functioned, you need to populate them mentally with hundreds of sweaty, oily bodies. Fill the pools with murky, contaminated water, cloud the air with steam, body odor, and the smell of rancid oil, and add the constant background noise of coughing, spitting, and casual urination. Only then do you have a realistic picture of what Roman baths were actually like. The Romans left us an extraordinary legacy of engineering, law, literature, and political philosophy. Their bathhouses remain architectural marvels that inspire wonder even in ruins. But they also left us a cautionary tale about the limits of technological achievement in the absence of scientific understanding. You can build the most magnificent facilities in the world, employ the most advanced engineering techniques of your era, and still create public health disasters if you don't understand the invisible world of microorganisms. As you stand as that bathhouse attendant in 212 CE, watching the last bathers of the day leave the baths of Caracalla, you survey the murky pools, the oil-slicked floors, and the damp walls with their invisible coatings of mold and bacteria. Tomorrow you'll scrape the accumulated grime off new senators and patricians, spread contaminated oil on healthy skin, and watch as people who consider themselves the height of civilization casually urinate in the same water where children are playing. The Romans believed they had conquered nature through their technology, that their engineering prowess had lifted them above the dirty, disease-ridden existence of less sophisticated peoples. They didn't realize they had simply concentrated and efficiently distributed filth they couldn't see, creating fountains of disease disguised as fountains of youth. The silk-lined couches and marble columns couldn't change the fundamental fact. Roman baths were magnificent, socially essential, architecturally brilliant, and utterly, spectacularly disgusting. The most advanced civilization of the ancient world bathed itself into sickness, mistaking their ability to move water for an understanding of what lived in it. They left behind ruins that still inspire awe 2,000 years later, and a reminder that sophistication and sanitation are not the same thing. That engineering marvels can be health hazards, and that sometimes the most civilized thing you can do is understand when your civilization is slowly poisoning itself in the name of progress.